Social Studies 30-1, going to take a quick look at democracy here. I'm going to talk about democracy in theory and definition, and then later on we'll talk about the features that make democracy democracy. And then as we go on, we're going to apply case studies to democracy. We'll look at Canadian democracy, American democracy, and Sweden, Western European democracy. Okay, to me, best way of defining democracy is to look at Lincoln's quote, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So just read that, give yourself a few seconds, let it soak in, and let's talk about what he really means. A government of the people, a government by the people, a government for the people. What he's really saying is that when a government is made up of the people, it means that we're all political equals. Anyone can run for government in a democracy. We're equal, we're egalitarian, we're the same. So regardless of how rich or poor you are, your stature or lack of whatever, anyone should be able to run as the Canadian Prime Minister. Anyone should be able to run and hopefully win as the American president. Now, whether or not that happens is a different story, right? Because it doesn't. But we're talking about democracy in theory. Anyone should be able to run for government. It's of the people. When he says by the people, what he means is the people pick it. So our government is who we choose. The government in a democracy is chosen by the people. And by that, he's also insinuating accountability. The government is there to serve the people. And if we pick it, you could assume then that we could also get rid of it. And that's political accountability. We pick it in an election. We can get rid of it in the next election. And finally, when he says a government for the people, he's saying the government is there to serve the will of the people. It is there for the people, not itself. Governments should not democratically act in their own self-interest. Governments are there to act in accordance of what is best for the people's wishes. Now, whether or not the people know what is best for them, that's a different story that we're going to talk about as we study democracy. But that is a good way of looking at democracy. So as we learn about different specific democratic systems, Canada, America, and so on, be thinking to what degree are those governments a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? I can tell you right now that in America, as of late, you need to be a millionaire to have a viable shot at the American presidency. The Bush clan are millionaires, Obama, the Clintons are millionaires, the Donald Trump is a millionaire. I'm not so sure it's a government of the people from that perspective, but again, we'll leave that for later on. Other one you could consider is Thomas Jefferson's The Will of the People. Democracy serves the will of the people. Again, it does what the people want. It does what the people need, not what the government wants or needs to stay in power. Come back to that one too. Just so you know, there are different names for democracies, democratic systems, liberal democracies, multi-party systems. There's more than that, but be able to recognize democracy by different names too. And if you'd ever wondered, it comes from ancient Greek words, demos, people, and kraton, government. Democracy, rule by the people. Historically, a lot scholars have said that democracy may have originated in ancient Greece, and it might have been democratic at that time. So in the setting of ancient Greece, the way they ran things, I guess, was innovative and progressive, and they might call it democracy. Today, we would probably call what they were practicing fascism. Because if you read the description, you can see that in ancient Athens, democracy was only for men. So right away, 50% of the population is outside looking in. It was only reserved for about 15 to 20% of the adult population, which is not democratic by today's standards, but back then I guess you could call that democracy. Women, slaves, foreigners were not allowed to participate in the democratic process. So this should say undemocratic. What am I doing? Anyway, just gives you an idea of where democracy came from. Finally, there are several different kinds of democracy, but for this course, you need to understand that what the Greeks practiced was known as direct democracy. And what that means is that people that could um, would directly participate in the democratic process. They would literally go to whatever the town square, wherever it might be, and they would debate and propose laws and vote on laws and budgets and so on. They would do that directly. Now, we can't do that in Canada or any democracy today, in that there's too many of us. So you can't possibly have millions of Canadians going to the House of Commons to directly participate in democracy. That would be silly. Um, we wouldn't fit. It would take too long. So what we do is we elect representatives that do all those things on our behalf. We're a representative democracy. And that's what all democracies are today. They're representative. We pick people. We call them members of parliament, MPs at the federal level. We call them members of the Legislative Assembly, MLAs at the provincial level. We call them councillors at the civic city level. They're our representatives. We elect them, and they participate in the democratic process for us. And then as early as ancient Greece, the philosophers were already contemplating, that democracy is not perfect. Plato criticized democracy. Aristotle criticized democracy for different reasons, but reasons that we can see when we look around today. So Plato criticized democracy for being unstable, and it just seemed really easy for leaders to use democracy at that time by playing on people's fears and superstitions. And if you look around, that is very evident in democracy today. You think back to the last American election in which Donald Trump won, and the fears and things that he played on to attract American votes probably proved that Plato was right to a degree. Same thing with Aristotle. Um, Democracy is very quickly undermined when the people that we vote for put their own self-interest ahead of the whole community. And that happens, I would guess, frequently in all brands of democracy. So no one's saying it's perfect, but if the alternative is a dictatorship or some kind of authoritarian regime, it might be safer to go with democracy. But we'll be investigating those things. Next thing I wanted to look at while I've got you would be the features of democratic systems. And this won't take long either. There's a lot of them. I condensed them into three or four important features that make democracy democracy. So when we study democracy, one of the easiest ways of understanding what it looks like and how it works would be to compare it to its alternative, the bipolar alternative, which is, of course, dictatorships. So in a democracy, decision making happens via consensus. So in a democracy, decisions are arrived at after debate, question periods, and then they vote on any policy, law, budget before it can be passed. That's what we mean by consensus. You don't just have one guy saying, we're doing this because it serves my best interest. Democracy things happen due to consensus. You need the will of the majority to make things happen. Now, we can debate a bit on what is consensus really. So do you decide things based on a vote um, in which 51% is considered consensus? I mean, sure, more people voted for something than against it, but is 51% really consensus? So some governments say that consensus is 60%. Some of them would say that consensus is maybe as much as 75%. So consensus, by definition, could mean a variety of different things. But in democracy, things happen according to consensus and majority vote as opposed to decree, which is what happens in dictatorship. Other things you want to consider, and I've mentioned this one a lot already, is accountability. In a democracy, the government's powers are limited and defined by a written constitution. And so the Constitution lays out, what governments can and can't do. They can't act outside of that written Constitution, or, for example, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Officials are held accountable through regularly held elections. So in Canada, elections happen at minimum every 5 years, and as you know, in America, they happen every 4 years, and that is a very fixed election date. Democracies guarantee individual rights and so on. And we've talked about that one a few times as well. Accountability, guarantee of rights and freedoms. Finally, the last one I'll talk about in terms of an important feature of democracy is opposition. And again, you don't get this in dictatorships. In a dictatorship, they kill the opposition or they imprison them and work them to death. We've studied that one to death. In democracy, different story. There needs to be, by law, an opposition. And by opposition, we mean a few different things. Opposition can mean an opposing political party that acts as a watchdog over the government. So today in Canada, the Liberals are the government, but the Conservatives are the official watchdog, the official opposition. It is their job and role to report to Canadians when they think the Liberals are stepping out of line. So, for example, a couple of weeks back, the Trudeau government tried to pass a policy law that would give them um, the power to rule by decree in terms of budgets until 2021. They wouldn't need, before they passed a budget, they wouldn't need parliamentary approval. And the Conservatives and other parties pointed that out and voted against that policy and actually voted it down. You need a political opposition. Opposition, though, doesn't have to mean an official political party in a democracy. It could just mean freedom of the press. It could mean you being allowed to think or say um, what you want about the government if you disagree with what they're trying to pass or their policies, budgets, and so on. That is what we mean by a democracy. You were allowed to express an opposing viewpoint without being worried about being arrested and sent to a gulag or even murdered for it, like we studied in dictatorship. So to me, those are the big four features of democracy. That is what really sets the system apart from dictatorships. And we'll study examples of this as we move forward.